Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Civil Rights Museum's Book and Author Series, now online, digital. Tonight, we're going to feature Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All by Dr. Martha S. Jones. But before I introduce Dr. Jones, I do want to take just a moment of reflection, pause. We do know that things have been very tumultuous in the last 24 hours and that our attention has been brought to the injustice regarding Breonna Taylor. So if you just indulge me for a moment, we'll just take a moment to center ourselves before we go into our conversation this evening. Thank you so much. Dr. Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at the Johns Hopkins University. She's a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the story of American democracy. Now, she's also the author of Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America. And she's a recognized public historian. You might have seen her on various news specials and in a number of outlets like the Washington Post, The Atlantic, USA Today, Public Books, The Chronicle for Higher Education, and Time. Let's welcome Dr. Martha Jones. Hi, Dr. Jones.
Hi, Dr. Trent. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. And I'm so excited because I have my own copy of Vanguard right here, and I have been reading it. It is a fabulous book. We're so excited to have you here today to talk about how Black women help change politics in this country. So I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Trent, for sharing this evening with me. It's a distinct honor to be hosted by the National Civil Rights Museum. And while I regret that we're not together this evening in Memphis, I will look forward to the next time where we can have a conversation and also have a real appreciation for the work that you all do there. And I look forward to that occasion. I am going to speak tonight about the history of African American women and the vote. My theme is organized around the history of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. We are marking this year in 2020, 200 years since the 19th Amendment. And one of my tasks in this anniversary year is to help us move away from some of the myths that enshroud the 19th Amendment to talk more directly about the complicated history of that moment 200 years ago. I think that this story that I'll share tonight about Black women and the right to vote is one facet of our wide-ranging national reckoning with the past, especially a reckoning with the role that anti-Black racism has played in shaping this nation. My hope is that through the opportunity to better understand, in a sense, what happened in 1920, we can forge new ways forward. Now, I'm someone, if you mention to me that you're celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment, you might notice that I cringe a little bit. Don't get me wrong. As Dr. Trent has explained, I've just finished a book about the history of Black women in the vote. And so I am as interested in anyone in this anniversary and its significance to the nation's past. And still, I can't quite bring a spirit of celebration to this occasion. That might just get in the way of the story that I have to tell. When we appreciate what an open secret Black women's disenfranchisement was in 1920, the facts of the 19th Amendment fit very awkwardly with events that might feature light shows or period costumes or marching bands. In 1920, members of Congress who promulgated the 19th Amendment, state lawmakers who ratified it, and the suffragists themselves all understood that nothing in the amendment's terms prohibited states from strategically using poll taxes and literacy tests and understanding clauses to keep Black women from registering to vote. Nothing in that new amendment promised to curb the intimidation and violence that threatened Black women who came out to polling places. Voting rights and voter suppression went hand in hand in 1920. I'm a historian, and so fortunately for me, there's nothing in my job that requires that I plan commemoration festivities. Instead, my work is to cut through half-truths and myths about the past and equip us with critical tools, those tools that we need to think about the future of our democracy. 25 years ago, historian Michel Rolfe-Triot looked back on the celebration in 1992 that marked 500 years since 1492, the year in which Christopher Columbus, it was often said, had discovered the Americas. Triot warned historians like me to give such occasions a wide berth. He worried that we would be drawn into promoting sanitized, partial truths, and even myths that those kinds of occasions demanded. The difficult history of European contact and conquest of the indigenous people of the Americas, including the role that Columbus played, were muted and even omitted altogether in 1992 in an effort to cast the anniversary as a celebration. That framing may have filled the coffers of tourist venues and souvenir sellers, but it did little to promote critical understanding of how colonialism devastated people and the lands of this hemisphere. When I'm asked about why I've stayed home from the celebrations in 2020, I note that the centennial of the 19th Amendment marks a milestone in the American history of voting rights. I add that remembering that era of voter suppression may help us see more clearly how ballots are being withheld from Americans in our own time. It may even encourage us to recommit to the ongoing work of ensuring that the voting rights of all Americans are protected. And I'm eager to contribute to the stories of Black women, these stories of Black women, to our collective understanding of the 19th Amendment. But as a nation, we're not quite yet ready for that grand celebration. The promise of voting rights for all still remains far out on the horizon. Let's drill in a little bit to August of 1920, when the 19th Amendment became part of the Constitution. I want to challenge two principal myths this evening. The first is one that I think you've probably heard. It goes something like, in 1920, with ratification of the 19th Amendment, all American women won the vote. You might even hear people remark that in 1920, women were guaranteed the vote. There is, on the other hand, a second myth that runs almost contrary to the first. And it is one that says no Black American women gained the vote in 1920, that racism kept all Black women from the polls in that year and beyond. So here we are in an anniversary year, and it's time to replace these myths with history. Voting rights in this country have always been born of struggle. The battles waged 100 years ago for a constitutional right echo in 2020 as American women continue to work against voter suppression and for full access to the polls. So back to August of 1920. The U.S. Secretary of State certified the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. He made sure that the requisite 36 states had ratified the amendment, and it became law. I want to just share with you the wording of that amendment, because careful attention begins to help us see the limits of the 19th Amendment. It goes, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." So what precisely did that mean for American women? Well, surely it was the case that now laws that reserved the ballot for men were in violation of the Constitution. They were no longer enforceable. And still, The 19th Amendment did not promise any woman the vote. Still, state laws, kept women from the polls based upon their age, their citizenship, their residency, their mental competence. Still in 1920, when an American woman married a non-US citizen, she lost her citizenship and her right to vote. So when women showed up to register in the fall of 1920, they confronted many sorts of hurdles, even if sex was no longer one of them. Now, for our conversation tonight, one additional barrier to women's votes also persisted, even after a federal amendment to the Constitution, and that was racism. It was true that the 15th Amendment in 1870 had expressly forbid states from denying the vote because of race. But by 1920, lawmakers in the American South and some in the West had set in place hurdles that, while silent on their face about race, had the net effect of disenfranchising African American men. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses had effectively kept many Black men from casting their ballots since the 1890s. Unchecked intimidation and the threat of lynching sealed the deal. Local voting officials effectively constructed a color line without ever expressly invoking race. So did American women win the vote in 1920? Not all women. African American women in too many states became, if you will, equals to their fathers and husbands. State laws disenfranchised them in an end run around both the 15th and the 19th Amendments, and registration numbers reflected the effects of those discriminatory laws. In the fall of 1920, Black women presented themselves to voting officials, but many found the books closed. We can point to examples such as that in Kent County, Delaware, where Black women turned out but were refused at the registration office because they failed to pass constitutional tests. These were administered by local officials who chose selectively portions of the Constitution, demanded that Black women not only read them, but then narrate or explain those provisions. I always think in this example about that clause that provides for the Electoral College. And I'm not sure that I could explain that, even as I'm someone who has long taught the Constitution. I certainly couldn't explain it under pressure and in the face of a reluctant and even hostile voting official. These are the kinds of hurdles that Black women faced. And yet we know that in 1920, even before a federal amendment to the Constitution, in many important places, Black women were already at the polls. In California, state law had enfranchised women, including Black women, in 1911, in Illinois in 1913, and in New York in 1917. Black women were experienced voters even before 1920 in those places. And then in 1920, many more Black women managed to register and cast their ballots in the wake of the 19th Amendment. This takes organizing. One example from St. Louis, Missouri. There, Black women organized under the auspices of the local Phyllis Wheatley branch of the YWCA. They stand up a suffrage school and prepare to register, teaching one another how to pay poll taxes, how to pass literacy tests. They turn out in numbers in order to stave off intimidation and violence. And news reports in 1920 indicate that all women in that city registered to vote, including nearly every African American woman. Contrast to the experience in Daytona, Florida, which was the home to educator and suffragist Mary McLeod Bethune. Mrs. Bethune had organized in 1919 and 1920 to get Black women to the polls and registered. But She, along with all Black Americans in the fall of 1920, faced a relentless and brutal wave of Ku Klux Klan organized violence. In Daytona, the Klan turned out on the eve of Election Day and marched onto the grounds of Mrs. Bethune's school, what is today Bethune-Cookman University, in an effort to intimidate her faculty, her students, and the other Black voters of Daytona. Now, the next morning, Mrs. Bethune and the Black women of Daytona turned out and didn't cast their ballots. But by 1922, the violence continued to be relentless, and Black voters are practically disenfranchised in the state of Florida. They will be kept away for the ballot for many more years. In 1920, Black women are organized politically. They are organized within their church associations, organized in sororities and in alumni associations. They are organized under the auspices of the National Association of Colored Women, which has upwards of 300,000 members across the country in 1920. And that organization was led by Callie Quinn Brown of Ohio, an educator, elocutionist, AME church activist, and for a long time, head of the suffrage department in the NACW. But in 1920, Brown is at the helm of that organization, and she understands the challenges that her members face, even after the 19th Amendment has been ratified. She needs a strategy and arrives at a plan that will look to win federal legislation that would give teeth to the 15th and the 19th Amendments, that would wipe out state laws that were keeping Black Americans from the polls and open the way to all Black women and their voting rights. This is Callie Quinn Brown's goal. How to get there is a question. And she recognizes that white suffragists, those in the National American Women's Suffrage Association and those affiliated with the National Women's Party, had run a troubled but very effective campaign to win the 19th Amendment. And Callie Quinn Brown contemplates the possibility that those women with success in hand might now link arms with African American women to win enforcement legislation in Congress. Callie Quinn Brown calls upon Alice Paul, the radical suffragist and head of the National Women's Party, in the winter of 1921. She turns out to appeal to Alice Paul to generally include the women of the NACW in the rituals around the suffrage victory. There's going to be, for example, a marble monument, a likeness of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Lucretia Mott, is going to be unveiled in the Capitol. And Callie Quinn Brown wants to be sure that Black women are there to participate in that occasion. It is really quite a spectacle. And indeed, Brown shows up with a contingent from the NACW. They appear in the parade. They pose with the monument, unfurl a banner. Callie Quinn Brown knows how to get Black women to the table with white suffragists, but still ahead of her is an effort to persuade Alice Paul to lend her political muscle to Callie Quinn Brown's cause. That work happens behind the scenes, and Callie Quinn Brown will lead a contingent of women from the NACW. They will call on Alice Paul in the winter of 1921 and ask her and the National Women's Party to join with them. And while we don't have a record of the precise words that were exchanged, what we know is that following that meeting, rather than join with African American women, Alice Paul decides to fold up, to close the business of the National Women's Party to declare victory and to move on. She will, by 1923, emerge as a champion of the Equal Rights Amendment, a cause that is still pending, still unfolding even today. But she will leave Black American women like Hallie Quinn Brown and those of the National Association of Colored Women to do their work alone. That is a story that will take us all the way to 1965. And finally, the passage of that federal legislation that Hallie Quinn Brown had been seeking 45 years later. Lyndon Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act in the spring of 1965. Of course, to get there, Black women have to engage in an extraordinary campaign for voting rights, now in partnership with African American men. There is the legal campaign that is waged out of the NAACP, defeating grandfather clauses, defeating whites-only primaries, defeating the poll tax. A legal campaign is one facet of what happens next. Black women continue to organize on the ground on Election Day. Those suffrage schools in church basements, in YWCA multi-purpose rooms, and more continue to operate to get as many Black women as possible registered and to the polls on Election Day. Nowhere more is that the success of that strategy exemplified early on than in Chicago, where the great Ida B. Wells and her Alpha Suffrage Club will help to elect Oscar DePriest to the U.S. House of Representatives, the first African-American man since 1901 to be elected to the House. Black women do that by continuing the ground game and getting themselves to the polls and moving the needle when it comes to particularly state and local contests. And of course, Black women will be at the fore of the extraordinarily dangerous and always courageous work of grassroots voting rights organizing and activism during the modern civil rights era. Whether we speak of a superb strategist like Diane Nash, or a forceful organizer like Fannie Lou Hamer, the great educator Septima Clark, or the mother who, to so many young people, Ella Baker, in the fraught but essential campaigns waged during the modern civil rights era. African American women are both in the leaders, among the leaders, and in the rank and file, forcing the hand of Congress, forcing the hand of Lyndon Johnson to take us all the way to the Civil Rights Act of 1965. Today, the 19th Amendment continues to prohibit states from denying the vote based upon sex, just as the 15th Amendment prohibits the state from using race when determining voting rights. And still, we know many American women do not have the unqualified right to vote. As was true in 1920, where a woman lives, for example, a fact that oftentimes correlates to her race, where she lives may still keep her from the polls. It certainly determines how she votes, when and where she votes, and perhaps if she will vote at all. Why? Because in some jurisdictions, though not all in this country, voter ID laws, shuttered polling places, the purging of voter rolls, and exigent matching requirements prevent many women, especially women of color in the United States, from voting in 2020. The policies of voting officials, especially in the context of a pandemic, likely mean that only some American women will cast ballots in the fall of 2020. The history of the 19th Amendment, it turns out, is more than myth. It is a sort of cautionary tale for our own time. And still, I think it would be a mistake to take the view that nothing has changed since 1920. Today, we understand, and as a nation, we understand, Black women have emerged as a force in American politics. How do we know that? Let's look at some examples. Not as far back as 2017, when the state of Alabama faced a special election to put in place a new US Senator, it was Black women who not only organized and got out the vote, but came out in disproportionate numbers, 98% of them voting in a block for candidate Doug Jones, electing him to the US Senate and flipping that Senate seat from red to blue in a US Senate where every vote counts. This year in 2020, more than 120 Black women are running for seats in Congress. This is a number that shatters the record which was set in 2016, just 4 years ago, when 48 Black women ran for Congress. Black women emerging as a force in Washington, and of course, as we know, in state and local governing bodies as well. Now, some of you may have watched that evening in August when California Senator Kamala Harris accepted the Democratic nomination for the vice president's seat on the Democratic ticket. Senator Harris took time to acknowledge the influence, the role that women before her have played in her political career. And she spoke movingly of her own mother and the model of her own mother and her mother's inspiration on her political career. But she also name-checked 6 women, all of whom appear in my book, Vanguard. It was a great list that really did remind us how Senator Harris, but indeed all of us, stand on the shoulders of extraordinary women who have come before us. Mary Church Terrell, the first president of the National Association of Colored Women, one of the fiercest African-American suffragists of her age, an activist against lynching, for women's suffrage, a great warrior for equality and education. She is on Kamala Harris's list. There is the great Ida B. Wells, journalist, social scientist, anti-lynching strategist, activist, thinker, suffragist in Chicago, and a great deal more, a woman whose pen was as sharp as her tongue. Kamala Harris stands on those shoulders. Mary McLeod Bethune, whom I've mentioned, the educator, suffragist, political operative in Washington, leader of Franklin Roosevelt's Black Cabinet, and delegate to the 1945 meeting that founds the United Nations, Mary McLeod Bethune. Diane Nash, the architect of the Selma campaign, behind the scenes in, as we all know, Nashville, behind the scenes in Selma, Diane Nash, one of the great architects of the Civil Rights Revolution, and Fannie Lou Hamer, out of Mississippi, who disrupts the 1964 Democratic National Convention to decry and declare illegitimate the Mississippi delegation, the white Mississippi delegation that had been selected without the input of Black Democrats in her home state. Fannie Lou Hamer, who knew how to use the podium and the camera to unprecedented effect, also inspiring Kamala Harris. And finally, and perhaps not surprisingly, in that they both share the guild, both are attorneys, there's Constance Baker Motley, who begins her public career as an attorney with the NAACP's litigation team, will run for public office, first in New York City, and then sit in the New York State Assembly, and then finally will be appointed to the federal bench and continue her work toward justice as a federal judge appointed for life. This is the story that Kamala Harris told us not so many weeks ago. This is the story of the women of Vanguard. They are indeed the shoulders on which the force of Black women in politics stand until today. So I think with that, I will pause, and if I understand correctly, Dr. Noel Trent will come back, and we have an opportunity for some discussion and I think for some conversation and also some questions. So thank you again, Dr. Trent, for sharing this evening with me, and I look forward to talking with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. And one of the things that I enjoy about your book, I think my favorite woman I'm reading about in the book is whoever's on the page, right?
Mm.
Every time you flip the page, you get a new person, and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm in love with this woman. And so you've just done a great way to emphasize that. But one of the things that I really enjoyed at the end of the book and the acknowledgments is that you said that you were indebted to the generations of Black women, but especially you found someone you were indebted to Ida B. Wells, who is very special here in Memphis. Can you talk about her role as an influential ancestor?
Absolutely. I will say that in approaching this book, I was a little afraid of Ida Wells. And I say that in the sense that the enormity of her vision, the breadth of her talent, the extraordinary reach of her influence, not only in her own lifetime, but I think in our lifetimes today, meant she was someone who could take over this whole book, if you know what I mean. She belongs in nearly every chapter of this book. But I saved a special place for her because she is such a deep inspiration for me in this book, but she really also exemplifies, I think more so than any other character here, why I call Black women the vanguard. You know, Ida Wells had a political vision that was multifaceted, that was unflinching, that was unafraid, right? Unafraid, unintimidated. And these qualities are the qualities I see running through so many women in this book. And she was never a one-note leader. She was never a single issue activist. That she understood that for Black Americans, including for Black women, it was necessary to work on all the fronts. It's from Ida Wells that we learn that the value of voting rights is extinguished if, for example, intimidation and racial violence are permitted to persist, that federal amendments are meaningless in a climate where lynching sets the tone for Black Americans. And so she bequeaths to us that kind of multi-layered, nuanced sense of what voting rights are and how to achieve them. And of course, you know, as many of us do, that she has received wonderful biographical treatment by some of our great historians, including Paula Giddings and Mia Bay, Patricia Schechter, and others. So I was really honored to single her out as someone who inspired this book.
Yet you also talk about other Black women historians who inspired you in this book, and especially a colleague who's near to dear and to both of us, Dr. Rosalind Turborg Penn, who was one of the founders of the Association of Black Women Historians, whose members right now are doing wonderful work at getting these stories of Black women out, of challenging what we think we know about American history and about women in America and their role in so many different facets. So can you talk a little bit about that legacy and how that influenced the formation of this book?
Sure. There's no question but that Vanguard is not possible with the absolutely pioneering work of Dr. Terborg Penn. She confronted a myth, and the myth was that Black women historically had had no interest in women's rights, no interest in women's suffrage, that Black women had been narrow, parochial even, and had limited their questions, limited their activism to so-called questions of race. Dr. Terborg Penn not only didn't buy that myth, she then went the full distance to prove that it was indeed a myth, a misreading, and recover the buried, covered up, concealed, elided Black women who had long been part of the long struggles for women's rights, including the vote in this country. She does that pioneering work and opens the door, right, to so many of us. Her book, which is published in the 1990s, is the first book I read about the history of women's suffrage. Think about how fortunate I was to not have encountered that other mythical literature that told me there was no place for Black women in that story. I read her first, and so my expectations are high for what we can do with this history. And you, of course, point to the organization that she helped to found, the Association of Black Women Historians, where I, along with many of us, I think including you, come together to understand that our work is a collective enterprise always, and that we are standing on one another's shoulders, we are citing one another's work, we are inspired and instructed by one another. For me, this book would not be possible without the historians. 3 going on 4 generations now. My students, I think, are the 4th generation of Black women's historians who are doing this work. And Vanguard would not be possible without them. I know folks don't always like to read the footnotes, but I say just thumb the footnotes, scan them to appreciate how many historians shoulders I stand on when I write this book. They are all there in the footnotes for readers to get to know and appreciate and to read more of their work as well.
Absolutely. And some of these women write phenomenal works as well, right? And so we want to lift those up. We are taking questions, so you can put your questions in the comments either on Facebook or as you're watching us right now, and we will try to get to as many as possible. I will not dominate the conversation with my own questions, and I won't keep this too academic for folks. One of the things that you talk about, and what you highlighted in your talk this evening, is this idea of the harm that's done with the celebration of the 19th Amendment and 1920. And one of the things that we see in this conversation when people talk about 1920, on the other end, they say, "Oh, it all began in 1848 at the conference in Seneca Falls, New York," which said that Black women weren't there. Now, I know Frederick Douglass was there. He was the only Black man that was there, but Black women weren't there. So what's the harm done when we decide that this era, 1848 to 1920, is the beginning and kind of the peak of the women's rights movement in this country? What's omitted? What are we missing?
Absolutely. So here is the foundation for that myth, right? Black women aren't in Seneca Falls, so they must not have been interested, right, in the women's rights questions that come up there. Well, my approach to this question is to be a skeptic of those stories, because Dr. Terborg Penn taught us the ways in which they have been profoundly misleading. And then to say, well, if Black women weren't at Seneca Falls at that women's meeting in 1848, where were they? Why don't we go take a look at where they were and ask what they were doing, what were they thinking, what were they working on. And in Vanguard, I'm able to, if you will, tell another version of the story of 1848, and it is about the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It is May, not July, and it is a gathering, not of a women's convention, but it is a gathering of the General Conference of the AME Church. What's going on at that conference? Well, church women have come with a political agenda. They have come with a women's rights agenda, and they have organized to appeal to the leadership, to demand of the leadership, a change in church law that would give preaching women licenses to preach in AME churches across the country. They are using the same sorts of ideas, the same sorts of tactics that we later see white women taking up in Seneca Falls. But it turns out Black women, even before Seneca Falls, are thinking about rights, organizing around their rights, and in the case of 1848, they win preaching licenses in the AME church. And so this, to me, was a lesson in how, if we stay, as researchers, right, if we stay in the frame offered to us by the history of white women's politics, we will miss Black women again and again and again because they were not there. And even if they may have been there, they were there in very small numbers. That most Black women, over the course of the long story of the 19th Amendment and then to the Voting Rights Act, are organizing in their churches. They are organizing in Black women's clubs, in their anti-slavery societies and literary societies. And so it is there that we have to go to recover them. And when we do, there is a great deal of talk about the women's capacities, what women have earned, what women's rights should be. And this pushes Black institutions forward, creates strife on other occasions, but is very much a regular and central feature of African American politics. And Black women put that on the table without any assistance or encouragement from women in Seneca Falls.
And one of the things I think is important is that when we do these, when the research is done about Black women, is that we find these stories in unexpected places, right? Mm-hmm. And so people aren't aware that perhaps their aunt, their grandmother, members of your own family are these living archives of these stories. So how do we work on preserving our own Vanguard? How do we work on creating the Vanguard within our own families? Not to say that everybody has to have a Stacey Abrams in your family, but what if you had an organizer in your family? Like how can our audience think about re-examining the work that the women in their family did and save those stories?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I think Dr. Trent, is that as I'm doing the research for Vanguard, I take a kind of detour. I didn't tell my editor. I just went ahead and took the detour because I realized that I didn't know the stories of the women in my own family. That as much as I admired and beloved as they are, I had never asked my grandmother, for example, when she voted, how she voted for the very first time. So I regretted that. And I went ahead to do some independent research into my own family. I discover my great grandmother, Fannie Williams, in St. Louis, Missouri in 1920, in that Phyllis Wheatley YWCA, helping to run a suffrage school. She's a suffragist in St. Louis in 1920. I find my grandmother in the 1950s in her home, adopted hometown of Greensboro, North Carolina, where she is working with the young women at that city's Bennett College to get Black voters registered and to the polls in the 1950s and 60s. So the first, I think, lesson of that is ask the question, right? To the elders in your midst. This is the moment to ask that question about the first vote. about the history of voting rights. And I think that many of us will discover, if you will, the suffragists of all kinds, right? Even as it sometimes is a singular woman who just has the courage, right, to face down the prospect of denigration or humiliation or intimidation at the polls, right? Maybe it's the woman who, carpools on election day, right, and makes sure elders get to the polls. All of those are the stories of Vanguard as well, because our work in voting rights is not only that, right, of the kind of leading women who are featured in this book. It is the story of the grassroots and how we do that work every day. So I hope that in some ways my embarrassment will encourage folks to ask those stories, to write them down, to pass them down. I've been asking my students to do that this semester, and the results are fascinating because they too are learning things about their foremothers that they didn't know and that are frankly inspiring them to appreciate the hurdles that American women have faced and continue to face, and to understand even the hurdles that they are experiencing in 2020 as part of a long history that requires activism and resistance and more.
So we have a question from social media, and it says, will you discuss other pre-1920 reasons women were prohibited from voting, such as marrying a non-US citizen could cause the loss of the right to vote?
Yeah. So, it's important to underscore that nothing in the US Constitution originally speaks to the right to vote. The right to vote is left for a very long time exclusively to the individual states. And this means that always American voting rights had been a very uneven patchwork, right? And the era before 1920 is no exception. States set their own age requirements. It might be 18, it might be 21. It won't be until the era of the Vietnam War that we get a constitutional amendment that sets the age at 18. States establish their own residency and citizenship requirements. In the early 19th century, white immigrant men to the United States voted in many places even as they were not citizens, because the states determined that non-citizens could vote if they met other qualifications. So women also come to encounter those kinds of uneven barriers to the vote around residency and citizenship. Rabia Belt, the legal historian at Stanford University, is working on a history of disability and voting rights, and points out importantly that ideas, judgments, and more around mental competence become another sort of barrier that is imposed on American women after 1920. You might be 21, you might be white, but if you were deemed in these old and now outdated clinical terms an imbecile, for example, you would be kept from casting a ballot. And yes, that even in 1920, Congress has provided that American women who marry non-US citizens lose their citizenship. This is an old carryover of the notion of coverture, right? That a woman's legal being, right, collapses into that of her husband, such that if her husband is not a citizen, she's not a citizen. And hence, if your state requires you to be a citizen, you cannot vote. You lose the right to vote. And Congress will not transform that or do away with that vagary until 1922. Even today, there is nothing in our Constitution that guarantees any woman the right to vote, any man for that matter, any American the right to vote. And this is why you can have one experience in the state of Georgia and another where I live in the state of Maryland where you all are in Tennessee or in Wisconsin, because still, especially after 2013, with the gutting of the Voting Rights Act by the US Supreme Court, the individual states have returned to a kind of at liberty regime where they can impose draconian requirements that result in keeping folks from the polls. So I think the myth that the Constitution guarantees to us the vote, that as citizens we are entitled to vote, is a myth that catches us off guard then when we realize that in a pandemic, nobody is obligated to get us a ballot. Nobody's obligated to mail us a ballot or create an electronic system for voting or otherwise ensure our health and safety and our ability to vote in November. Nobody, no state official is required to do that. And the burden in the US still remains on individual citizens and citizens collectively to get each other ballots, to know how to cast those ballots, to get those ballots counted. All of that burden still rests on us.
Well, I just think you shook a whole bunch of folks' realities right there, with that statement that it is as not as secure as we sometimes think, and that there's so much at play, and if people thought we were at risk in for this upcoming election, perhaps this will motivate folks in the audience to really think about it even more so. Um, Before we close out this evening, I do want to talk a little bit about Black women politics and this whole state sanctioned violence and extra legal violence that women are encountering as they're trying to pursue this vanguard, this edge, this pursuit of freedom and civil rights, because we continue to see that come up over and over again, whether you're a Black woman abolitionist in the 19th century or, activist in the 20th century or even civil rights activist. These sorts of acts of violence against women have become a way to suppress them in some way. So could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I want to thank you very much, Dr. Trent, for acknowledging where we sit on this day. Many of us still reeling from events in Louisville and the injustice that has followed in the wake of the killing of Breonna Taylor. My way of thinking through the events of yesterday was to think through what I learned in writing Vanguard. And it's one of the facets of this story that I had not seen or understood plainly enough when I started this book. And it is, as you say, the role state-sponsored violence, state-sanctioned violence has always played in the political lives, the personal lives, but the political lives of Black women. And there is hardly a woman in this book who, when you probe her biography or you read her memoir, or you pore over her letters, there's hardly a woman in this book who doesn't tell a story of having been accosted, assaulted, denigrated, threatened, and worse. That Black activist women have always been the targets of violence. Ida Wells, who we spoke of earlier, of course, was just one of so many who, traveling on a segregated railroad car, refuses to give up the seat. She's bought her ticket and she knows precisely where she wants to sit and should sit. But the brutality of that encounter, again and again and again, taught me something about the centrality, as you say, of violence in intimidating, suppressing, and really looking to keep Black women from exercising their full capacities as citizens. You know, Mary McLeod Bethune runs a girls' school in Daytona, Florida. It's a girls' school in Daytona. And that doesn't keep the Ku Klux Klan from marching in full regalia on horseback after burning a cross in the river, from marching onto her school grounds. And so, as we reflect upon the life and the unspeakably tragic death of Breonna Taylor, for me, it is important to sadly fold her into that story and to recognize that this is part of our history, oftentimes unspoken. What are the difficult stories to tell in a family? It is oftentimes these stories. In my family, these were not the stories that were told. These were not the stories that were repeated. But for many of us, they are part of our family histories. They certainly are part of the histories of our communities. And I know folks in Memphis know this all too well. Yes, the women of Vanguard teach us the history of these very, very difficult lessons that we are continuing to have to confront in 2020.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things for us to think about in this particular moment is a question that a colleague of mine poses through his nonprofit, which is, what kind of ancestor will you be? What's the legacy that you're leaving? And I think that your book, Vanguard, really sets a roadmap for us to draw inspiration from these women, to look at them and say, wow, I didn't know that. But what can I learn then to be like them, to be part of the Vanguard, so that someone else can form their own Vanguard squad? And I think that should be a social media thing. I think we should do it. We should just say hashtag Vanguard Squad, and people can name family members, historical women that they admire, tag you in it, because I think that's a way for us to draw the inspiration out of the moment to help ground us in the work that we have to do. So thank you so much, Dr. Jones. It has been a pleasure to have you. I really, really wish you were here in Memphis, but we'll work on getting you back here. Thank you so much to our viewers for joining us in this pandemic age as we have retooled our programming to offer you something digitally. If you have more questions, if you read Vanguard and are dying to know what she was thinking about this, guess what? Dr. Jones is on Twitter, and so am I, and so is the National Civil Rights Museum. So engage with us on social media. If you refer people to this discussion, tag us at NCR Museum. Don't forget hashtag Vanguard Squad. I'm sure I'm going to work on my own Vanguard Squad and put it on Twitter. I think everybody else should. And let's draw inspiration from these women as we approach the next few weeks and head into the election, that we will not grow weary in well-doing, and we will continue this legacy of being on the edge and pushing this country forward. So thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.